Okay, thank you. I'm Helena. I'm from The Guardian. I work there as the editor for the data projects team, which is a small team that works together with reporters and editors to help them find stories in data, basically. I have to announce my Swedish background. I worked 20 years with Swedish television, for those who wonder. Also, most of the time they're doing data journalism for Swedish television. I also must say that I am quite new to graph databases, so some of my questions might seem naive for you, so I apologize for that. So to my right, I have Meredith.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi. I teach data journalism at NYU. Are we doing presentations now, or are we doing introductions?
No, let's just do a little introduction.
So I teach data journalism and computational journalism. I started my career as a computer scientist, and I quit to become a journalist. And now I do data journalism, which is really, it's a nice fusion of the two.
And I'm Leila Haddou. I currently work for the Financial Times on the investigation team. And prior to that, I worked at The Guardian, doing some work on the data blog and data-driven investigations. I have a couple of years' experience using and teaching graph databases to find stories, which I will talk about in a moment.
Hi, I'm Fred. I started off kind of with open data advocacy, and I realized that if you have a lot of open data and nobody uses it, that's kind of stupid. So I started working with journalists, and now I've ended up working for something called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is a fairly obscure but interesting network of around 35 or so reporting centers doing large-scale kind of cross-national investigations, mostly in Eastern Europe.
Okay, if I could get that one. If we could get the first presentation up, please. I hope. Oh, there I am. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about the Panama Papers. I'm sure you've heard about them through this conference. I wanted to talk especially about the little part of Panama that was the structured data, because in general terms, when we talk about Panama Papers, we talk about the 11 million documents database and so on. But actually, there were a part of Panama Papers that had a little bit of a structure. There were, from our perspective, a couple of Excel spreadsheets, actually, with 200,000 companies and 600,000 shareholders and about a couple of 100 or 150,000 intermediaries, which is the clients that connect the people who wants to create an offshore company with Mossack Fonseca. So the thing, though, is that for journalists in general, present company excluded, is that a 200,000 row Excel spreadsheet with maybe 60, 70 columns is way too scary to get into. It is, I mean, you laugh, but for journalists, I would say 80, 90% of journalists will think that this is really, really scary. So I must admit that I addressed those Excel spreadsheets by pulling them into a relational database and starting looking for relations that way. But for most of the journalists, this was sort of the savior, and the gateway into this is the database that ICIJ started. So this is a little bit in order. Yeah, that's the sign. So if you search for instance, what we did here, if you search for Cameron, you will find Ian Cameron, which is, or was, he's dead, David Cameron's father. And if you then look at him, you will see the little connection that we found. And we did a lot of stories on this little connection, where we found a company here, a trust that he had owned in Panama. And we could do lots of stories. This was actually our first story. Our front page story on the first day from The Guardian at the Panama Papers was the story about this little connection, this one little connection. It did very well. But as I said, this is a part of this Excel spreadsheet, and I'm sure for most of the people sitting out here, this doesn't look very scary, but I can assure you that this is extremely scary for most journalists. Another story that we did was the big story about the cellist that might or might not have helped Vladimir Putin store all his money, Sergei Rodolgin. And we can then search for Rodolgin, find, and there we also see the little problem with when you have, as you know, very dirty data in, you also get quite dirty data out. So here we have 3 different Rodolgins. It's the same guy, I can tell you. And you can see the connections here. And for journalists working at Panama Papers, I think that this was very sort of a way in to start looking for documents to see that there is something here. There's a couple of companies, there's an address, there is something here. Let's go look for more. So that was a little bit of my sort of view into graph databases.
Okay. Great, thanks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my work in working with campaign finance data. So could we get the next presentation up? There we go. So a few years ago, I started working on a project called Bailiwick, which is a tool to help investigative reporters quickly and efficiently uncover new story ideas in campaign finance data. Generally speaking, my work is about artificial intelligence for investigative reporting. And I was looking around for a new realm to build AI tools for, and I settled on campaign finance because we thought that the big story of the 2016 presidential election, among data journalists, we really thought that campaign finance was going to be the big story. We were totally wrong, of course. The story of the 2016 US presidential election was not campaign finance, to everyone's great surprise. But nevertheless, I spent about a year building a system for analyzing campaign finance data. And toward the end of my development cycle, I read the Panama Papers investigation. And I immediately thought, oh my gosh, this is the technology I have been waiting for. Because graph databases, to me, are a very intuitive way of capturing the way that reporters think about relationships between people. So if I went home and I said, oh, I was on that panel with Leila, and she was really great, and I want to get in touch with her, but I don't have her email. Oh wait, I can get in touch with Helena, who knows Leila, and they used to work together, and so that to me is a graph database. I have this giant graph database stored in my head about connections between people, which is something that I developed as a reporter, and that is the intelligence that I apply to campaign finance reporting. So let me just walk you guys through the campaign finance system that I built a little bit. What we did is we took data from FEC, from Open Secrets, from the IRS, from Open Elections, from ProPublica's campaign finance API, and from Twitter, and kind of squished it all together into a system. You can set up an account and have a watch list for candidates that you are following. You can follow certain candidates, like if you're if you're a reporter in Montana, you can follow all of the candidates for Senate in Montana, for example. This is the architecture. You can see that we've got Postgres and we've got Neo4j, and then the data's coming in from all these different sources. And then we have an extremely sophisticated graph diagram here. There was a lot of whiteboarding in this project. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking all of the data from these different data sources, I'm dumping it into Postgres, and I'm dumping it back out to Neo4j, and then using it to try and find story ideas. So it's still a little bit in process, but we're very excited about it. And we've also got a Linkurious front end that we put onto it. Bailiwick helps you uncover new investigative story ideas. Here's an example of finding a story idea. So I'm saying, all right, show me a political committee named American Medical Association and tell me something about its government contracts. Actually, that should be administrative spending. So spending by the American Medical Association on administrative expenses. What was the total? What was this percentile? And so this is a story idea because investigative reporters know that when you are looking for a story, there are certain things that you look for. So overspending on administrative expenses is a red flag. Okay, we can't build a system that says, oh, this political committee is definitely committing fraud because they're spending too much on administrative expenses. That's not fair, that's not ethical, and it's not true, right? But it is a red flag. It's something to investigate a little bit more. So the system can help guide you to where can you find stories. There's also a Slack integration. And so the key elements that I'm working with here are automation, visualization, workflow integration, and importantly, it's a human-in-the-loop system. So when I say AI for investigative journalism, people often ask me, oh, so you mean you make systems that do the investigative reporting for you, that replace investigative reporters? And I say, no, I don't do that, because you can't do that. That is impossible to do. I build human-in-the-loop systems because human brains are really, really good at finding connections, and I'm interested in building tools that help human beings to do a better job and a more efficient job of finding those connections. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So Leila's going to talk a little bit about.
Yes, I'm going to speak a bit about some stories that I've worked on. If we could have the next presentation.
Hopefully.
Sure it's coming up. Yeah. Well, while we wait for it, one thing I should say is, here we are.
Yeah.
Most of my stories tend to be very ad hoc, as I'm sure you'll see. So each data set becomes a graph database for the purposes of that specific story. What I've put on screen is half of what my introduction to graph databases was. Back in 2014, I was working at The Guardian, and a developer told me he'd built a database which had political donations from the Electoral Commission website, and he'd taken company data from the Open Corporate API. I don't know if people are familiar with that website, but they bring in corporate data from registries around the world where possible. And what that really enabled me to do, or any investigative reporter to do, is see at a glance a much bigger picture of what was going on with political donations. So, for instance, you might have Lord Bamford donate to the Conservative Party, but wait, he's also a director of these three companies who have also donated. So it was just a very quick way of getting a much better idea of what was going on. Does this work? Okay, my button's not working. There we are. So one example of using that particular database was when we had a leak of the Conservative Party donor boards that are, quite notorious in how secretive they are. And what we used it to do was find out quite quickly in one afternoon the true scale of the wealth of these individuals and what they actually had been given. If you notice Howard Shaw on the right-hand side, it says personal and company donations. So that was just one way that we could give a better idea of what was going on with the political finances. At the Financial Times last year, I worked with a scraped registry from Cambodia, which was provided by an NGO called Global Witness. They've done a lot of work highlighting corruption, land grabs, human rights abuses in Cambodia. So they gave us access to the data in advance and allowed us to just look at China. I've included this little business diagram on the right-hand side because it does look very much like a graph database. I suppose that's what it is. And every one of our business investigations look like this. We're sketching out connections and parent companies and directors and shareholders. So I mean, it wasn't the only thing I did, but I took the data and I made it into a graph. And one of the patterns that I noticed in there, this is just one example of many, where there were sort of 5 in the blue here, 5 supposedly separate companies with 5 different sets of named directors. But interestingly enough, they all had the exact same contact detail, which seems quite a lazy way of trying to hide the fact that you are actually just the same people. We didn't necessarily know why until you look at land concessions in Cambodia, and it's this cluster at the top, just under where it says Cambodia's concessions. They're all right there next to each other. In Cambodia, you're only allowed a certain amount of land, up to 10,000 hectares, if you're a foreign company. And these were all just under that, all right next to each other. So it was suspicious that this was a way of circumventing the rules. So that's what we decided was going on. We managed to get behind we had to find the gentleman behind all of these companies who has gone through great lengths to reorganize his companies to stay off the China rich list. So he's quite a shady character anyway. So we then sent a reporter over there who indeed confirmed that that was indeed the case. But I mean, this was important because there have been allegations of land grab. The UN is now about to get involved as well. So that was a story and a pattern that came about just by using a graph. This wasn't mine, but it was done by a colleague of mine at the Financial Times recently. And what he did was work with a social media analytics company to try to determine which Twitter accounts in the network of Geert Wilders were potentially bots. And the way they did that, they looked at unusually high tweet rates or linking to stories such as Sputnik or Russia Today to determine which ones seemed to them very bot-like. And they came up with a network here. You can see in the red that they're all sort of clustered over there. And the idea was to try, in this era of fake news and propaganda and potential interference with elections, was to try to have a look at how these accounts sort of spew these social networks. So that sort of, from my perspective, as an investigative reporter, I tend to use graphs as an exploratory tool. But my colleague, David Blood, who's over on the data team, obviously used it in a different way. So I hope that gives you some ideas of the stories that come out of it.
Thanks.
And that's it.
All right. Well, then we can put on the next presentation, please. So yeah, we're a little bit more obscure. So I think OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which has a slide of its own, but not on the screen.
Could we get the last presentation, please?
There we go. So fundamentally, I think we've talked about campaign donations here. We've talked about donations to parties here. Fundamentally, a lot of what we do is kind of following the money, right? And if the button worked, that would also show up here. Come on. So let's talk about following the money. I want to talk about it in the context of money laundering. So this is $500 million. For all I can tell, it's $500 million because someone had expert knowledge of clip art and Microsoft Word and put this fancy frame around it. What you do then is you add a little bit of paperwork to make it look like this is a debt that a Russian company owns to a British company, and you involve a Moldovan citizen in that transaction. Then you go to a court in Moldova and you tell them, hey, can you please make a court verdict that says this is a legitimate debt and we now need to transfer $500 million out of Russia into Moldova and from there to a destination of our choosing. And what you have now is what every superhero needs. You have an origin story for your money. So you're now kind of getting money into this building there. This is a bank, and it's not any bank because, as you can see, its headquarters rival that of HSBC, Barclays, and other major banks. So they've handled, I think, 15 billion. It's called Trust Commerzbank. It's been shut down now. But nobody, this is in the European Union, so it's kind of fully passported, and like money from there can move to everywhere all over the world. And that's exactly what happened to about 20 billion of dollars kind of coming out of Russia, going through Moldova, going to Latvia in part, and then to companies all over the world. And we ended up basically with a database of 70,000 or so transactions of money going from these kind of shell companies, mainly hosted actually in the UK, unfortunately, to destinations all over the world, whether it's in Cyprus, whether it's in other offshore jurisdictions, or whether it's in kind of consumer goods and stuff like that. So how can technology help us to kind of follow the money? And I've been trying to kind of explore different approaches for this for a while. Sometimes, as in the case of this money laundering stuff, there's just simple kind of accounting stuff. You want to see who the top recipients are, so a SQL database will do just fine. The difficult part is getting from the bank transcript back there, which is PDF, into the SQL database, which is hopefully not PDF anymore, and making kind of structure in the data. I think that's probably everybody in this room has had a moment where they had to kind of go from unstructured data to structured data. That's kind of where you lose 80% of your happiness and time. And once you've done that, you can kind of start thinking about more sophisticated stuff. This is the magic power of a construct called the join. If you have a data warehouse, and we're starting to kind of build up a little bit of a data warehouse of kind of public data sources, open data, but also previous leaks, previous information that came out, you can kind of start joining the information that you now have, the recipients of the money, with those leaks, and kind of say, okay, what are all the matches between, let's say, the structure part of the Panama Papers and the Moldovan money laundering scheme, and then you have investigative leads. And I think this is kind of the king's discipline, is how do we kind of use data tools to actually generate leads, to generate something that a human can then say, hey, this is something I need to investigate, this is something I need to iron out to kind of make sure that it's true. And what you need to do for that is you need to kind of somehow start encoding societal ideas about what makes a piece of data interesting into tools, and kind of start having a minimum threshold of interestingness, which is a really interesting concept for a database to deal with. And obviously, in the end, what you want to do is you want to end up with a way of analyzing the data kind of at your whim. What we're doing at the moment is we're basically building data enrichment pipelines, right? So you take all those recipients of laundered funds, you send all their names through public databases like Open Corporates or our own database, which is called Aleph, if you want to visit it at data.occrp.org. And then you end up with kind of an enriched construct where all those possible leads and possible extensions are in there. And then thanks to the amazing help of the Neo4j DevRel team, which I want to give a shout to because they're amazing, and they've become data journalists over the last year. And thanks to Linkurious, you end up with something that kind of gives you a way of exploring the data. But that's actually kind of also where your trouble starts, right? Because kind of developing with journalists an understanding of like the idea of shortest path, or what the relevance of that is, and also kind of having enough data density to actually be able to find shortest path between stuff, but still having a graph that's clean enough to still make sense for a human being to look at. That's something that we haven't fully figured out yet. How do we find that kind of place, or what are kind of the mechanisms that need to be in place for that? So I hope that in the future we'll have much better data processing tools for journalists, and yeah, go to the moon with it.
Thanks. And I think that these all sort of show us the thing that all of us in different ways struggle with, which is sort of a transferring sometimes something that is very, very messy, comes in PDF formats, or is sent in by 45 or 280, 290 different agencies, and turn that into something that we can then start asking questions to, because as journalists, we want to ask questions. So we're going to talk a little bit more, but I want to make a lot of time for you guys to ask questions for us as well. So do we have a time? Because I don't have a watch. Well, that's great. So we have a little time. So I was just wondering if you guys could talk or have a little more experience in data. Is there, because we've heard about campaign finance, we heard about leak data, structured data. Is there data, what is good data for graph databases, and what is bad data for graph databases?
I feel like I only ever get bad data. I work with dirty data all the time. And in my classes, I start with clean data because I don't want the students to get demoralized. And then by the end of the class, we deal with dirty data, and it's very frustrating. But then at the end, it's very invigorating because they have conquered this dirty data. So yeah, all data is dirty, and it's because it's made by people, and people make mistakes. And those of you who are working with kind of structured input, and your data comes in relatively clean, like I'm sort of jealous of you that like you get this nice clean data to work with.
So in terms of dirty or clean, certainly with tax leaks, as you saw with the Panama Papers, you wouldn't want it to be too clean because you wouldn't want to make any mistakes with that. But in terms of what data sets would make a good for graphs, for me, kind of anything where there can be a connection with something else. So even though I did, political donors and open corporates, we could then have brought in contract data and see, well, are they getting government contract? Or we could bring in offshore property ownership. So I think, there's a lot of choices out there, but it's just knowing what to put together and what potentially you could find in it, I suppose.
So what is bad data for graph databases?
I think purely structural data, right?
Yeah.
I kind of like dirty data. Dirty data is where no man has gone before.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool. But like when you have only structural data, right? Like there's this amazing data set, the persons of significant control here in the UK, right? But it's only about like the structure of stuff. What you then need is you need something happening, right? You need to have evidence that someone has done something with this company that's really shitty, and then you can kind of trace it up to who actually is behind it. Then you've got a ball game, right? But I think as journalists, we have access to public data sources. Public data sources have a tendency to be about the structure of things, and it's much cooler if we can kind of get stuff about things that happen.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe it's like there's data that is length, and there's data that is width, and like a lot of public data is like just length, and you need the length and the width to make an interesting story.
Yeah.
I think also that us as journalists, we talked about before we came in here, we talked about that we consume a lot of different data. That's what you do. I go through, and that is, in one way, everything, if we're widening it a little bit, everything from an ONS statistical table about population in the constituencies of the United Kingdom right now, and the age structure of the constituency, without saying too much about what we're looking at The Guardian right now, but of course we're working at the election, to extremely, Panama Papers was extremely, the structured data there was actually quite unstructured, and it was with a lot of errors, a lot of spelling mistakes. There were several company names crammed into one field and that sort of thing, which I like. I kind of like that too, where it's a challenge, where actually where you can imagine that there's been other people looking at this saying, no, I'm not going to do this. That's the kind of data that I want to do. Or data that we collect from different kinds of, I once asked the 45 police authorities in England, Scotland, and Wales for data. I will not kid you, it came in 40 different formats. Anything from they sent me a paper document, to they sent me an Excel spreadsheet, to they sent me a text file or 10 text files, or all that kind of things. And that is in our case, that's half the battle, really. Once we sort of get it to start looking for stories, I have a feeling with what you've told me that's when the graph databases come in, where you can sort of start looking at that. But a lot of our work, just to give you an idea, is 80% of our work is cleaning the data. And then the fun part is to sort of start looking for what kind of story can I tell with this. But I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on sort of what would you, as a journalist, want to say to the non-journalistic community here when it comes to data and that kind of thing? Is there a message we want to give them?
I don't know. Fred, you want to start?
I'm a developer. I can't make that. I want to say something to the journalists on the panel, which is stop having amnesia, right? Because what you're describing just now is like this phenomenon of journalists doing a new thing every day.
Yeah.
And you described it before as data polygamy. And like the idea of kind of a new data set 5 days a week. And like what actually journalism lacks is master data, right? It's kind of, it doesn't have the idea of creating kind of long-running data infrastructures of like, if the next Panama Papers come out, what is the first million names we're going to put into them to look it up, right? I can buy that from Thomson Reuters for $200,000 a year or something. But we don't actually have access to it in journalistic organizations most of the time. So that's something we need to build. And that's actually something that I think kind of we need to get off the daily horse a little bit and kind of onto the data infrastructure train.
I think that's interesting because there are sometimes occasions when I work with developers, and yes, we do want these big databases that we can say a lot of the leaks we've had before, how can we check whether this new data set connects with them or is related to the people in this one? And I think there is a lot of scope to having kind of a master data set, but often you'll just want to do something for your own story because it's not a Panama Papers and it's not millions of rows, but it's still got the potential to have some really significant stories in it. And then you kind of get into a wrangle with the developer that wants to turn it into a huge thing, and you think, no, I just want to query it. So I think there's scope for both.
Oh, yes.
To take place.
I actually get into, I run into that problem a lot where in my class, I teach about here's how you take a data set, you analyze it, you find 3 or 4 stories out of it because stories are your bread and butter. If you're a reporter, you need to have a backlog of story ideas in order to pay your rent, right? Like journalists distinguish themselves in the newsroom by always having a lot of story ideas. But then at the same time, as a developer, I do want to build these massive systems that could theoretically be used for reporting for many, many years. But there isn't really time or money or interest in the newsroom in building these, in building and maintaining massive systems. And building the systems is very exciting, but maintaining them is very boring. And so in newsrooms, there tends to be a lot of turnover, especially among development staff. So newsrooms actually have a really difficult time maintaining their internal technology. There's an open source project called Panda or Pandas, which is different than the pandas you guys are probably familiar with. This project is about making technology to centralize data sets in a newsroom, to like have a master archive. And it was a great idea. It works well. It's operating in a bunch of newsrooms, but it's open source and they don't have any more funding. And so it's kind of, languishing. It's a little sad.
I think that is also the thing that the few times I've tried to maintain a database, we built a wonderful database of all the schools in Sweden, for instance, and added in. The thing is that if you as a parent in Sweden want to check out the new school that you're sending your children to, you had to download 6 or 7 different Excel spreadsheets and then started to sort of compare those different Excel spreadsheets. And what we did was we put them all together. It took me, I think, 2 weeks every year at least 2 weeks every year to sort of put the new data into. And we figured out that work maybe came out to 1, 2, 3 stories a year. So and there you have sort of the problem with that you always have to weigh sort of the time you put in from the time and I get the million names you want to put into the next leak. My problem is that a lot of people drop off the rich list. So you will have a rich list that is not, so you have to have sort of a constant. So that is in one way a dream, to use artificial intelligence to constantly update those databases. Because what happens, I think, as journalists, I've also gone down that road where you try to maintain databases. What you see is that what you sit with is usually old data, and you have to start over again.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have one more question, then I want to let you guys in, and that is, if we could wish for a new feature or a new thing, what can we see in the future when it comes to connected data and graph databases and other databases for us as journalists? What would be? I would wish for a database that could look more into unstructured data, of course, that could find connections between names in documents instead of just names in databases. That would be lovely for my sake.
Yeah. I will actually compliment something. I really like the Neo4j sandboxes. Have you guys played with these? Raise your hand. Yeah? Okay, so the thing I like about the Neo4j sandbox is that I don't have to load the data, because it's so much work to clean the data and load the data and like create the schema like before I do exploratory data analysis. So I just appreciate that there's this like thing out there, and I can like do exploratory data analysis and demonstrate exploratory data analysis in in campaign finance data or in the Panama Papers or in Twitter data without having to go through all the prelude myself. So that's actually made it a lot easier for me to explain relationships between data to people who are less familiar with it.
So I have to agree with Helena about the unstructured to structured. I spent 5 weeks of my life recently manually having to go through almost 1,000 sets of accounts to look for details of transactions. So it's not just names, but also amounts and details of actual transactions that have taken place. But having just said that I like kind of being able to do ad hoc projects, I do actually want what you described as well, which is a master data set of everything that's gone before as a starting point. It would just save so much time and effort. If we could get it to update automatically, that would be great.
I'm also with you on the soup to sense stuff.
Yeah.
But I think what I really want is a little alien creature that attaches to the left temple of journalists and kind of pulls out what they're thinking about, what kind of their hypotheses are about who's connected to whom and what kind of the story is. And then we can kind of build a recommender engine on top of that that kind of based on the data that's available publicly gives them recommendations of where to look next. Alternatively to the alien, we can also just have really good tools that allow them to store their ongoing process of doing an investigation.
Yeah.
But I like the alien.
And I think you're right. I came to this country having worked in journalism for 20 years in Sweden and got thrown into the Panama Papers project. And that was an interesting project because for me, it was a very sort of daunting for me because I was sitting with people just like that who would look at a name and say, I mean, I did recognize Ian Cameron, I must admit that. But beyond that, there was a lot of people. There are amazing reporters who have all these graph databases in their head, which, he gave a lot of money to Tony Blair in blah, blah, blah. I'm sort of, yes, I have no clue who that person is. So that was a real daunting thing. I have that all that knowledge about Swedish politicians and Swedish power people, but that would, of course, be very good if we can extract the graph databases out of the brains of people. That would be really.
See, I actually did something for my bailiwick project that I think fits with both of these. I went around and interviewed people who are expert campaign finance reporters. And I said, what are the stories that impacted you the most? What have been the most high-profile stories? What have been the most interesting stories? And when you take a data set, what do you look for? And so I interviewed dozens of people and just sat down and talked with them about their reporting process. And then I took all of my notes and extracted the kind of high-level story ideas that were common across all of the people who I talked to. And then I built the system against that. So I built the system so it would surface the most common types of stories that people look for, which was a different way of going at it.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if we have any questions.
Unfortunately, we run out of time.
We're out of time. Oh, no.
We can't take questions on this stage, but I'm sure the four of you will be
here
on the side, maybe there. And if you have any questions, do approach them and ask them. We'll be setting up the room for the final keynote. So join us here again in 20 minutes for Jim Weber's final session of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.